All right, let's dive deep into the 2008 financial crisis. We're going to try to figure out how such a seemingly stable system, just went kaput. And maybe even more interesting, who saw it coming.
Yeah.
So to do that, we're going to use Michael Lewis's book, The Big Short.
Great book.
Yeah, it really takes us behind the scenes and with the folks who saw the warning signs and actually bet against the market and ended up, profiting from the crash.
Yeah, it's a wild story, really. What's interesting is, it all starts with something that seemed like a pretty good idea at the time, subprime lending.
Okay.
But boy, did it spiral out of control.
Yeah, so let's break that down. Subprime lending. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about, mortgages for people who were riskier borrowers.
Yeah, exactly. And we're not talking about like slightly higher risk. We're talking about loans being given to people who were less creditworthy than 71% of the population.
Wow, 71%. That's a huge chunk.
It's a lot of people.
So what kind of loans were they getting that made them so risky?
Well, there were a few different types. You had interest-only loans, where the borrower only paid the interest on the loan and not, any of the principal, so their debt never really decreased.
Oh, wow.
And then there were these things called negative amortizing mortgages, where the amount you owe actually increases over time.
What?
Yeah, imagine a loan that keeps getting bigger, even when you're making payments.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. I mean, what were lenders thinking?
And then it gets even crazier. You also had low doc or even no doc loans.
Okay.
Where borrowers didn't even have to prove their income or their assets.
Really?
Yeah, they could just say, hey, I make this much money, and get a loan based on that claim. No proof required.
So you're telling me that people were getting mortgages without having to show that they could actually pay them back. I mean, that's crazy. But wouldn't that risk just be limited to those individual borrowers?
Right. Well, that's where things get really interesting and dangerous. These risky loans weren't just sitting on, the bank's balance sheet. They were being bundled together into these complex financial products called mortgage bonds and then sold off to investors all over the world.
So it's like taking a bunch of iffy ingredients, mixing them all together, and then selling the resulting dish as like a gourmet meal.
That's a great analogy. And it was almost impossible for investors to see what the individual ingredients were, how risky they might be, or how likely they were to, spoil the whole dish.
Okay, but someone must have been overseeing this, right? What about those credit rating agencies we always hear about, like Moody's and Standard & Poor's? Weren't they supposed to be assessing the risk of these bonds?
Yeah, in theory, yes. But this is where the system really starts to break down.
Okay.
Because these agencies were giving a lot of these mortgage bonds AAA ratings, the highest possible rating, which created a false sense of security for investors. It's kind of like giving a 5-star rating to a restaurant with a really questionable health inspection record.
So investors were being led to believe that they were buying something safe and secure when in reality it was incredibly risky. Did anyone see through this facade?
That's what's so great about The Big Short, right?
Yeah.
A handful of people did see the warning signs, and their stories are they're fascinating.
Yeah.
But, to really understand how they saw what everyone else missed, we have to understand the role that Wall Street played in all of this.
Okay.
Because they weren't just passive observers, They were actively fueling the subprime mortgage fire.
So Wall Street was actually profiting from a system that they knew was flawed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they saw a ton of profit potential in subprime mortgages and these complex securities, and they encouraged lenders to lower their standards and just hand out mortgages to, anyone and everyone.
So it wasn't just greed, it was like a deliberate strategy.
Exactly. And Lewis reveals some shocking details about how they exploited loopholes in the rating agencies' models to get higher ratings for some truly awful loans. It was like a game that they were playing, and they were winning. At least for a little while.
So they were profiting whether the housing market went up or down?
Yeah.
That's pretty messed up.
It definitely raises some questions about, the ethics of the whole system, and it set the stage for this dramatic collapse. But amidst all the chaos, there were a few individuals who saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah, these contrarians, the outliers.
Exactly. The people willing to bet against the entire system.
That's what's so crazy about this whole thing.
Yeah.
We've got a system rigged for disaster.
Yeah.
But a few people see the danger, and they have the courage to bet against it. I want to meet these people.
Let's do it.
So we've got this system like teetering on the edge, and you're telling me there were people who not only saw this, but they actually bet on the whole thing collapsing. I mean, that takes some serious, guts. Let's start with Dr. Michael Burry, this physician turned investor. What made him so different?
Yeah, Burry's a fascinating character. Lewis describes him as brilliant, but also kind of eccentric, someone who didn't really, get social cues that well. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
Okay.
And it's interesting how Lewis explores how Burry's personality and this intense focus played a role in his investment strategy.
It seems like being able to like block out, all the noise and zero in on the data would be pretty crucial, especially when everyone else is caught up in the hype.
Totally. Burry wasn't really swayed by conventional wisdom or what other people were saying. He was just obsessed with finding these undervalued assets, and he was incredibly thorough in his research. So while other people were celebrating the housing boom, he was poring over loan prospectuses, like really trying to find the hidden risks that everyone else was ignoring.
What were some of the red flags he was seeing that other people weren't?
Well, one of the things that really jumped out at him was just the sheer number of negative amortizing loans that were being bundled into these mortgage bonds. The loans where the amount you owe actually increases over time.
Right.
He even found this one mortgage pool that was made up entirely of these loans where borrowers could defer paying any interest at all.
Wow.
So their debt would just keep growing.
That's insane. I mean, and no one else noticed this.
Well, Goldman Sachs actually congratulated him for being the first person to buy insurance on that pool. They didn't see it as a problem. They saw it as an opportunity. But Burry knew this was a disaster waiting to happen.
It's incredible to think that he was so far ahead of the curve. But even with all this evidence, I imagine it was tough to convince other people that the housing market, which seemed so strong at the time, was about to collapse.
It was. He faced a lot of pressure, a lot of skepticism, even from his own investors.
Oh, wow.
They thought he was crazy for betting against the housing market. Imagine you're so sure of something, you have the data to back it up, but you're facing resistance from, literally everyone around you.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly frustrating.
It was.
And lonely.
Okay.
But he wasn't the only one who saw this coming, right? You mentioned Steve Eisman. What was his take on all of this?
Yeah, Eisman's another really interesting character in The Big Short. He's like the cynical, outspoken hedge fund manager, deep distrust of Wall Street. He saw the subprime mortgage market as this predatory system that was designed to exploit vulnerable borrowers.
So unlike Burry, who was very data-driven, Eisman was kind of coming at it from a more human-centered perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was outraged by what he saw. He wasn't just looking at numbers on a spreadsheet. He was talking to borrowers, visiting neighborhoods that were being hit hard by foreclosures, witnessing the impact of these bad loans firsthand.
It sounds like he was really connecting the dots between these abstract financial instruments and the real-world consequences.
He was, and it solidified his belief that this whole system was just built on a foundation of sand.
So we've got Burry with his data-driven approach, and then we've got Eisman, who's kind of coming at it from a more cynical, human-focused lens. Were there any other perspectives that Lewis highlights in The Big Short?
There's one more duo that's really interesting, Charlie Ledley and Jamie Mai. They were running this small hedge fund called Cornwall Capital, and these guys were total outsiders to Wall Street, but they had this uncanny ability to spot opportunities where everyone else just saw risk.
Just the classic underdog story.
Totally.
How did they get involved in this whole, betting against the subprime market?
So they actually started out by looking for the absolute worst subprime bonds, thinking that they were so cheap there was nowhere for them to go but up. But then they stumbled onto something even more interesting, and they started looking into these collateralized debt obligations, the CDOs.
CDOs, those were like the bundles of bundles, right?
Exactly, yeah. The Frankenstein monsters made up of other Frankenstein monsters.
Yeah.
And what really struck them was that even the seemingly safe, highly rated tranches of these CDOs, they were still filled with the same toxic subprime mortgages. It was like Wall Street had found a way to disguise the rotten ingredients by layering them between, some seemingly edible ones.
So they were gaming the system, making these risky assets look safer than they actually were.
Exactly. And Ledley and Mai, they realized that if the subprime market collapsed as they suspected it would, even those highly rated CDOs were going to go down with it. They were essentially betting against the very thing that the entire financial system considered safe.
That's a bold move. Did they have any experience with these kinds of investments? It seems like such a David and Goliath situation going up against these giants of Wall Street.
They didn't, and that's what makes their story so compelling. They were starting with a tiny amount of capital, working out of a spare bedroom, going up against these massive financial institutions, but they had this incredible drive to understand the market and this willingness to bet against, like, the consensus view.
So we've got these three groups. We've got Burry, we've got Eisman, and then we've got Ledley and Mai, all with different motivations, different approaches, but they're all kind of converging on the same conclusion, right? This subprime mortgage market, it's a house of cards. It's about to collapse. What happens next?
Well, the cracks in the foundation start to show. You know, the housing market begins to cool down, defaults on mortgages start rising, and the warning signs become impossible to ignore. But the question is, will the market heed these warnings, or will it just cling to this delusion that everything's fine?
So we're at this point where, all the warning signs are flashing red. Defaults are going up. But you're saying that even with all of that, a lot of people on Wall Street were still in denial. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but that's exactly what Lewis describes in the book. Remember those CDOs we were talking about, those, bundles of mortgage bond bundles? Even as things started to go south, even as the ABX index, which tracked those subprime mortgage bonds, started falling, Wall Street firms were still churning out these CDOs and selling them to investors.
I don't get it. Why would they keep pushing these toxic assets when it was so clear that things were about to go bad?
It really comes down to, I think, a few powerful forces at play here. Greed, delusion, this desperate hope that they could somehow outrun the inevitable collapse. I mean, they'd become so reliant on the profits from those CDOs. Their models were so ingrained in this belief that housing prices would just always go up. It was almost impossible for them to accept the reality that, the party was over.
So they were like trapped in their own little bubble, just blinded by their own success.
Exactly.
But surely the rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, they must have stepped in at some point, right? I mean, they were supposed to be the ones providing this independent assessment of risk.
They did, but it was a really slow and painful process. They were very hesitant to reevaluate the ratings they'd already given to, trillions of dollars worth of these mortgage bonds and CDOs. They knew that if they downgraded those ratings, it would trigger this massive sell-off, and it could potentially just cause the whole financial system to melt down.
So it was a combo of fear and also just not wanting to admit that they had been wrong.
Yeah, and maybe even complicit in creating this whole mess.
Right.
And that's one of the key things that Lewis, highlights, that the rating agencies played a huge role in enabling this crisis, and they were really slow to kind of acknowledge their own part in it.
So the truth couldn't be hidden forever? There had to be a breaking point. What was it?
Yeah, there was. And it came in September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers, one of the oldest investment banks on Wall Street, filed for bankruptcy.
That's the big one, right?
Yeah.
That's the event that kind of signaled the global financial crisis.
It is. Lehman's collapse was a huge event. It sent shockwaves through the entire global financial system. It was like a dam breaking. All this fear and panic just swept through markets all over the world.
Yeah. What about the investors we talked about before, the ones who kind of saw this coming and bet against the market? What happened to them when the whole thing finally blew up?
Well, their stories are interesting. Michael Burry, who had faced so much resistance from his own investors, he was finally vindicated. His bets against the subprime mortgage market paid off big time, earning him and his investors massive profits.
It must have been, I don't know, a bittersweet victory, right? I mean, to be right about such a catastrophic event.
Absolutely. And Lewis talks about this, the complex emotions that Burry experienced. He was relieved, of course, that his analysis had been correct, but also deeply disturbed, by how bad the crisis got and the suffering that it caused. And he actually ended up closing his fund and just walking away from the hedge fund world completely.
Wow. What about Steve Eisman? I mean, he always seemed energized by the fight against Wall Street.
Yeah, Eisman and his team also profited, but for him, it wasn't really about the money. He was motivated by a sense of, moral outrage. He wanted to expose the recklessness and the predatory practices of the industry. And so while he felt a sense of vindication, I think, he was also really shaken by the sheer scale of the crisis and what it meant for the world.
So even for the people who predicted this collapse, and made money from it, it wasn't just a simple victory, right? There was a lot more to it.
No, definitely not. It was this realization that the system itself was really flawed.
Yeah. And then there's Charlie Ledley and Jamie Mai. What happened to those guys? The underdogs who bet against the system from their spare bedroom.
Yeah, their story is maybe the most remarkable of all. I mean, they ended up making a fortune, turning their tiny fund into a major player. Their willingness to challenge the status quo, to see those risks that everyone else missed, it really paid off.
It's incredible to think that these guys who were, originally dismissed by Wall Street ended up doing better than a lot of the big players.
Totally. But I think even for them, the experience was really transformative. They saw just how fragile the whole system was, how close it came to just collapsing completely. And it was a stark reminder that, the global economy is all interconnected, and what happens in one place can have a ripple effect everywhere else.
So after all that, after Lehman Brothers collapses and the whole global financial system's on the brink, what happened? Did the world just descend into chaos?
Well, the world did enter a pretty dark period with a global recession that impacted so many people. Governments all over the world had to step in with these huge bailouts to stabilize things and prevent, a complete economic meltdown.
It's hard to overstate the impact, that the 2008 crisis had on people. People lost their jobs, their homes, their savings. The effects were felt everywhere.
It's a powerful reminder of, how interconnected our financial system is with our lives and the consequences when things go wrong.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into The Big Short, what are some of the key takeaways? What can we learn from all this so we don't repeat those same mistakes?
Well, what's fascinating about the book is it doesn't really offer easy answers or simple solutions, It's a really complicated story with a lot of different layers, and a lot of people were responsible, a lot of people are complicit. But I think, one of the biggest lessons is just the danger of complexity in financial markets. When things are so opaque and hard to understand, it creates opportunities for people to take advantage of the system.
Yeah. It also shows how important it is to think critically, right? To do your own research. Don't just trust what the experts are saying or what the rating agencies are telling you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, all the people who saw this coming, Burry, Eisman, Ledley, and Mai, they all questioned everything. They dug deeper. They saw things that other people missed because they were looking at the problem from a different angle.
And they weren't afraid to go against the crowd.
Exactly. And I think that's an important reminder for all of us that sometimes the consensus view can be, dangerously wrong.
Right.
And it raises an interesting question. How do we create a financial system that's more transparent, that's more accountable? How do we prevent this from happening again? And how do we foster this culture of critical thinking, not just on Wall Street, but everywhere?
Those are some big questions to think about.
Yeah.
This deep dive into The Big Short has been, it's been eye-opening, to say the least. It really shows just how complex the financial system is and how much is at stake when things go wrong.
I mean, it's a story that should really stick with us, make us question things, challenge assumptions, and demand a more responsible, more accountable system.
We encourage you to check out The Big Short yourself and explore some of these issues on your own. It's a great read, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.